I know you heard me on the radio, flexing. She loved the sound of my voice, it's the best thing. Daydreaming of the jazz all day. Pick up the phone late night with Larry K. I know you heard me on the radio, flexing. She loved the sound of my voice, it's the best thing. Daydreaming of the jazz all day. Pick up the phone late night with Larry K.
Night Watch listeners, Scarlet Knights fans, welcome to another episode of Night Watch. I am your host, Larry K., and we are still doing a post-mortem on the Rutgers men's basketball season that many have considered to be a huge disappointment, which I don't think many people would debate at this point. I just wanted to discuss today two articles that came out kind of participating in this post-mortem that I think warrant some discussion. A lot of good information in both articles. One article was by Brian Fonseca entitled 5-Star Flop. The other one from Jerry Carino, Fonseca obviously of NJ.com, the Star Ledger, Jerry Carino of the Asbury Park Press, and Carino's article was titled Rutgers Basketball, What Went Wrong in 24-25 and What Has to Be Addressed. And both these articles bring up a lot of really good points, and I think we should discuss some of them. I have seen out there in the message board sphere and just generally across Rutgers message boards and in discussion forums. And this is to be expected because this seems to be the primary focus everywhere you go when you talk about college athletics right now, and for good reason. There is such a focus on NIL when it comes to both these articles and when it comes to what people have gleaned from these articles and what people want to discuss regarding Rutgers. The complete emphasis seems to be on NIL spending and the lack thereof, and there's a debate. Does Rutgers, do their fans need to dig deep into their pockets? Does Rutgers need to tax, season ticket holders? Do they need to up student fees to pay student athletes for NIL because Rutgers is so vastly behind in NIL, and that feeds into a narrative about Steve Peichel and the job he did this year with roster construction and coaching and personnel decisions and offensive philosophy or lack thereof, and the way he approached the season with the 2 5-stars. And it's taking over this world mind of its own where this is becoming completely focused simply on NIL. Rutgers was so far behind on NIL that they just couldn't put a viable team on the court around Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper, and it's taking over, all the air out of the room. So I wanted to break down some things that we saw from these articles that we could glean from. So Fonseca opens his article discussing the fact that when Steve Peichel got the commitment initially from Ace Bailey, and subsequently, obviously, he got the commitment from Dylan Harper, although a lot of people knew that Dylan Harper would be a commit for quite some time. Steve Peichel tried right away, and there was a meeting at the Rutgers Club that Fonseca references, trying to let people know that NIL was here to stay and that in order to have the best team possible, they were going to need to donate, and he was going to need NIL donations, and there was no way around that. And Fonseca specifically points out the fact that, and I won't go into specific details because it's behind a paywall. You got to go to NJ.com and sign up there. And by the way, both articles, but Fonseca's in particular, the research done, the quotes he got, just very, very good journalism and reporting. If you really want to know kind of the ins and outs and behind the scenes of what was going on in the athletic department regarding NIL, I suggest you check it out. But he goes through a lot of specific information and things about what was going on in the athletic department. But long story short, essentially, and both articles say this, and this has been kind of the smoke for a while, that Pat Hobbs was not doing enough to facilitate NIL. That Pat Hobbs was essentially ignoring some of the collectives, that Pat Hobbs was not courting new people to donate, and that he was really sitting on his hands by and large when it came to NIL for basketball. And while Schiano was going out there to his own personal Rolodex, and Schiano was raising money on his own with a lot of people who apparently really didn't have a lot of affiliation with Rutgers, Steve Peichel struggled to do that. He didn't have the same Rolodex. He didn't have the same network, or maybe just is a different person in general and wasn't as, adept at getting those donations. And he says that because Steve Peichel was at a loss when it comes to procuring NIL, he was at a vast disadvantage when guys were leaving our system, specifically Mawat Mag, Cliff Amori. He couldn't retain guys, and when it came time to woo guys like Jaden Jones, like Matalako, he had trouble getting them. Now, if you read about Matalako wanted to go to Notre Dame. He's a legacy at Notre Dame. I don't know how much NIL really played into that. Everything, if you remember back before NIL, every time a kid didn't go to Rutgers, there was always some muttering about some uncle with a bag and a bag man, and maybe that was true sometimes. Maybe sometimes it wasn't. And you're going to hear the same now. It's always, well, they have NIL. And sometimes there's other factors that play into recruitments. It's not just NIL. I mean, just look at Bailey and Harper, right? But long story short, a lot of what's discussed at the beginning of both these articles, and that seems to be all anybody's running with, is that we didn't have enough NIL, we got to get more NIL, and that was our biggest problem. But if you look at Fonseca's article, he links to Jason Belzer's Twitter, and he discusses Jason Belzer, how Belzer is an NIL expert, how he could have been tapped by the athletic department for some guidance, and he was not. And he links specifically to a Belzer graph to illustrate the point that Rutgers was vastly behind in NIL funds. But what's interesting is everybody's just saying, yeah, he was way behind on NIL funds. He couldn't do anything. If you look at Belzer's actual graph, and you look at, he breaks it down by conference, and he has high majors, then low majors, then mid. He goes all the way down by caliber of conference, and within each conference he gives the 90th percentile of spending, he gives the 10th percentile on the low end of spending, and he gives the median percentile. And Fonseca reports that Rutgers had about $1.5 million in NIL funds. $1.5 million, and that is supposedly, amongst most of the conversation taking place right now, way at the low end of the spectrum, and that's why Rutgers just couldn't compete. Rutgers couldn't even get a tournament berth. Rutgers was vastly ill-equipped and wound up with a losing overall record in the regular season, a losing record in the Big Ten, lost to teams like Kennesaw State, blah, 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 blah. The failures of the season are because Rutgers didn't have the money. But if you look at Belzer's graph, the 90th percentile of NIL funds in the high majors was $3 million. Well, 90th percent and up, $3 million. The 10th percentile, so the lowest 10%, is $500,000. $500,000 at the lowest 10%. The median, which means if you have a median here and such a high 90th and such a low 10th, the median, a lot of teams spent clearly below. The median here is $1,250,000. That's the median of high majors. High major median is $1,250,000. Rutgers had $1.5 million. So Rutgers was on the upper half of NIL funds. $1.5 million, the upper half. Now, it wasn't at the $3 million level, which was the 90th percentile, but it certainly wasn't at the $500,000 10th percentile, and the median was $1.25 million. Rutgers was at $1.5, so by $250,000, which is probably a player, Rutgers was above the median, not just overall, above the median in high major conferences with NIL funds this year. And then you say, well, Larry, sure, they were above the median, but they weren't in the top 10%. They weren't 90th percentile. Teams were spending $3 million. Well, then you look at a team like Indiana, which Fonseca points out, Indiana had about $5 million in NIL. Indiana had an absolutely terrible season. They switched head coaches. They had a huge disappointing season. And I'm just saying that the conversation is going so far in the way of, well, we just need NIL. We didn't have NIL. It's not Pike's fault. Fans got to do better. We got to do better, need NIL. All those things are true that we need to do better with NIL if we really want to compete at the highest of levels. And we are nowhere near competing at the highest of levels. But when maybe the highest spender in the Big Ten at $5 million, which had to be at the tippy top of the 90th percentile, maybe 99th percentile, if they spend $5 million and they still have a disappointing season, And Rutgers is in the top half of NIL funds with $1.5 million. And the biggest blunder from Rutgers is not even getting a tournament berth. It's one thing if Rutgers got a tournament berth and lost in the first round and fans are mad, they want to compete for Final Fours, and you say, well, you can't compete for Final Fours unless you're in the 90th percentile. You're half of the 90th percentile. You got to do better on NIL if you want to compete for Final Fours. I think we all agree on that. But Rutgers fans were simply asking for a tournament berth. To not be a bubble team in the last month for the Big Ten tournament. Rutgers fans were asking for some success. Now, this is Fonseca, as he reports, this is the first team in the one-and-done era with this much talent on the roster to not even get a tournament berth. Rutgers had money in the top half of the high majors as far as NIL. And they couldn't even get a tournament berth. And the team was 99th percentile, at least of the Big Ten, maybe not high majors in general, with the Big Ten, also had a terrible season. So it's not all money. If Rutgers was in the bottom 10%, or Rutgers was even in the bottom half, there might be an argument that money is the reason Rutgers simply had an overall losing record and couldn't make the tournament. But losses to Kennesaw State, losses to Princeton, absolutely inept offense at times, almost all season an inept defense, except for a few games. A lack of getting down to a decent rotation that had some coherence by midseason at least. All these things have nothing to do with NIL. And so the focus exclusively on NIL, I think, is way overblown here based on some of the reporting we're getting postseason, postmortem. And now, I understand that both articles do talk quite a bit about NIL, and the fact that Rutgers did not have and does not really have a dedicated GM type person who's managing the roster, the spending, and we still, as Aaron Brightman has rightly pointed out, we are a rudderless ship that doesn't have a president, doesn't have an athletic director, and so even getting somebody like that in the athletic department is a while away, given the fact that we just don't have any pieces in place to run a coherent organization. That's all valid. And the fact that NIL was a problem is valid. But I just want to point out that when you look at the actual figures as cited in the reporting, it's not as, I don't think, the most prevalent factor, or at least an independent prevalent factor, even if it's one of several factors, that is the main thing that warrants discussion with this current failure of a season. Now, it's interesting, though, because when you look at the $1.5 million figure, and then you think about it a little bit further in terms of not just raw numbers, right? But the actual day-to-day practical considerations for not having an NIL infrastructure in place with the athletic department, it does open your eyes a little bit more. You look at Carino's article when he's discussing fundraising and NIL management, specifically with Coach Peichel. And Fonseca discusses this too. Peichel, because he didn't have the support and he didn't have the fundraising, he had to go out and find creative ways to make money. And so when they reached that $1.5 million threshold, which was in the upper half of high major conferences, according to Belzer's statistics, in order to get there, he had to divert a lot of his attention away from coaching. And he also had to find ways to get the money where, $1 million came from the Vegas tournament. Now, I don't think the Vegas tournament was a negative, right? You lose to two good teams, ranked teams, fighting till the end. You get good experience. You beat a not good team in Notre Dame in double overtime. You get experience. You get experience against other high major teams early in the season. They don't destroy your resume. You came close to winning one of those games. If you win one or two of those games, your resume is actually pretty good because it's a neutral court at that point. And so playing though that tournament wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The Kennesaw State schedule was a huge mishap in my opinion, as that was, you know, everybody, all indications are that was kind of a nod to Ace Bailey to go play that game, but they were playing that game on the way to the Vegas tournament. They were looking ahead to that tournament. They were cocky after some of the other games maybe, and that was a huge blunder on the road against them, and the way that they kind of exposed Rutgers followed us the rest of the season. That was a Pikel thing. But then the game in Newark against Princeton netted significant money. And so you start looking at some of the scheduling decisions. A lot of people couldn't stand the Princeton game. And from what I understand, the Princeton game, Princeton was scheduled because another team backed out for the Prudential Center game that was supposed to occur. And that's money, right? So Rutgers and Steve Pikel did, if you want to talk about NIL, they did need to try to scramble to find other sources of raising money. And some of that affected the way that Rutgers built its schedule. So if you want to blame Steve Pikel for his scheduling mishaps or criticize his scheduling, some of that scheduling, at least some of it, was because out of necessity, because he had to build NIL funds, right? And so that is an issue. Now, here's the thing, and this is where Fonseca really starts getting into more of the nitty-gritty. And Carino does it at the end when Carino starts discussing, you know, what has to be done going forward, right? Fonseca points out that when Pikel went out and the guys he assembled, yes, they were kind of bargain bin guys, right? But because they were from lower conferences. But they were good at their lower level of playing. And based on what NIL you have to do the best you can with the money that you're spending, right? And when you have money in the not no money, above the median money, you have to allot that money properly across your roster. And what I think we saw with this team is when Pikel went out and got guys and brought all these transfers in, perhaps he could have, you know, we brought a lot of guys in. Maybe you scratch 3 of those guys and just pay a Cliff Amore. I know Cliff was commanding maybe 7 figures. I don't know how that would have worked out. But, or maybe you consolidate it and go after another viable big man, a one step lower than Cliff. You need a rim protector. Maybe you consolidate 2 of those guys into more of a refined defender with experience from a lower level, rather than, you know, a guy who can shoot, or you think can shoot because he can, you know, spot up and shoot when he's got an open, quick look at a lower level. Maybe you go after a guy who's a little more proven as a gritty defender, and you spend 2 of those salaries that you spent maybe on a PJ Hayes and a Zach Martini. Maybe you spend that on a guy who's more of a proven defender. With the money that Pikel had, I still think it's fair to say that the way he spent that money and a lot of that money across the roster was, you know, is open to criticism, because the raw figure of how much money he had is not woefully at the bottom of the teams he was competing against. So how that money was allotted, that leaves something to be desired. And when you're looking at the article specifically mentions, you know, Duke, and how Duke was able to surround Cooper Flagg with some more refined, disciplined defenders and people who fit the overall fabric of that roster, whereas Rutgers was surrounding Ace and Dylan with a ragtag group with no real philosophy on how these guys are going to fit in. Jordan Durkak comes from a system where he's playing primarily zone, and Steve Pikel wants to run a man pressure defense. That alone is a red flag. Now, there was some bad luck too, right? They point out that Cooper Flagg didn't have to battle an illness the way that Dylan Harper did, and then the ankle injury, which cost some games and cost some experience. I point out Tyson Acuff, I think, was probably one of the most pivotal things that happened. Tyson Acuff getting a huge injury to his ankle that never really, by the time he looked up to par, it was a little too late. But I was listening to, even the TKR guys on their podcast, which is another fabulous show that I listen to regularly. And they're talking about the fact that, Tyson Acuff, who actually is getting some points when you break it down as you're going down the stretch, he's not playing all the minutes that he should. He's playing less minutes some games, and maybe that's matchup dependent. Maybe he looks cold, but when the guy was on towards the end of the season and he showed that he could be a legitimate offensive weapon, he didn't necessarily get as much run as maybe he should have gotten. And so there were coaching decisions that the TKR guys mentioned that the rotation was way too deep, way too late in the year. It's unheard of to be playing 11 guys, that deep into the season. And he still was, because he hadn't settled on a rotation or a philosophy that made sense. And Fonseca reports, he reports here, look, Peichel experimented with 12 different starting lineups and regularly used 11-man rotations to find the right mix. Regularly used 11-man rotations. That's just ridiculous. And it's not ridiculous because you're hitting a wall and you need to shake something up and it's just not working. It's ridiculous because from the inception of roster construction, you should have a plan. You're getting these two young men. You know what their skill sets are. You know what Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey's skill sets are. When you're constructing your roster from the very beginning, you certainly should have some semblance of a plan as to what the rotation's going to be and how these pieces are going to fit together. And the fact that we consistently saw 11-man rotations deep into the season, and they changed so much from the onset of the season all the way through the end, tells me that there never really was a concrete plan as to how you're going to put this team together and what it's going to look like. And that is a failure of roster construction, not just with money, not just with guys not producing the way you thought, but with roster production in general, construction in general. And the other elephant in the room is that we're relying, and this is where I think some people should have seen it coming, and I certainly had some suspicions. These are two freshmen, okay? And these are kids, 18-year-old kids, 17, 18-year-old kids going up against 25-year-old men. And there was some commentary in the articles regarding other coaches and quotes, and it was the fact that this might be the worst year or the worst time period to try to go in and go to battle and have success with two superstar freshmen and rely on exclusively really two superstar freshmen, because there are so many fifth-year players out there. There are so many guys in their mid-20s who have developed defensively, who know the college game, who are more physically developed, who are more experienced, you're going to have to go up against. And no matter how talented you are, your draft status, and this was also pointed out, your draft status is dependent on your potential in a different league and what you're going to grow into in that league as far as the NBA, right? Your draft status is not necessarily indicative of your pecking order overall of how good a player you are at the current level at the current time. And Dylan Harper at times looked unstoppable going to the rim. He's an extremely talented player. He will be an extremely talented NBA player. He's an extremely talented basketball player. Ace Bailey had his moments. Sadly, Ace Bailey struggled as well many times, on and off. He had good games and he had really not so good games, and that might be to be expected. But as is pointed out as well in the articles, guys like Lathan Somerville, rather than being coached or rather than listening to the coaching or whatever occurred, rather than having a guy like him take it to the hole, take it to the rim, get tough down low and have higher percentage shots, he settled regularly for shots well out, a few feet away. And sometimes it looked pretty and he looked graceful doing it, but that's not what you should be trying to get out of a guy like that the most. And Fonseca breaks down a really nice chart, if you go to the article and check it out, of the percentages that Rutgers had and how many shots they took from what parts of the floor, and it was just abysmal. It just seems like Steve Peichel, a defensive-minded coach who had spent years developing guys over the course of several years, first coaching them up individually on defense and then coaching them up as a team on defense, went all out just trying to plug holes in a roster with offensive firepower and not much semblance of an idea of how he was going to employ those skill sets in an offensive system, knowing, or should know that he struggles sometimes with offensive systems and getting the most out of guys offensively. So you're recruiting against your strength, which is defense. You're recruiting totally on offense. When you already have two very talented offensive freshmen on the roster, you should be going out and recruiting defensive players to complement them, because your bread and butter is also defense. So if you can get guys who are already brought along and developed a bit and get the most out of them defensively, while the talent alone is going to elevate the offensive guys you have, you might have fared better. But we just didn't do it. And it's really a problem. And I think it's not just NIL, but it's the way the roster was constructed at the beginning, the way the pieces were employed, the way they were used, the way that they were, rotated, and all of those things contributed to this failure. Now, Steve Peichel was clearly flustered, dropping F-bombs, as Fonseca points out, everybody knows, after the buzzer beater loss to Michigan, refusing to talk to the media after losing to Purdue by 29. He's quoting the GPA of the team, even though we're in an era where these kids are barely going, they're not really student athletes because they're here for a cup of coffee, then they're gone. Talking about the fact that our recruiting class is highly ranked, which it isn't necessarily highly ranked, and it's a bunch of freshmen coming in next year, again leaving us with some of the same problems. And it just seemed to sum all that up, and you could glean it from both these articles. I know it opens with NIL and the athletic department dysfunction, and that's a big part of it. But there's a lot of other things that are an issue at the coaching, head coach, and below level. And it goes to allocation of resources with what we did have with NIL, how we built the roster building philosophy and strategy, and then philosophy on the court in terms of defense, offense, coaching decisions. I'm going to just skip the individual defensive coaching, run right to team defensive coaching. I'm going to try to go all out with offensive firepower and just let the chips fall where they may, as opposed to bringing in defensive guys who can keep the cohesion with this team. I'm going to bring a tenacious kid like a Jordan Durkak in, but I realize that he hasn't had experience in a system like mine. So regardless of how tenacious he is, it's going to be difficult to, get what I need out of him to get cohesion on this team. There are several factors that led to the failure of this season that are outside the scope of simply spending. And these failures are going to persist unless there's a epiphany and a philosophy change or some kind of strategic decision made when it comes to Steve Peichel and this Rutgers basketball program. And this is where Carino's article, I think, shines a lot too at the end of his article. And Fonseca does an excellent job of breaking down the statistics and the X's and O's reasons for a lot of the failures. And Carino, kind of on a big picture analysis, lays out the fact, and this is what I've been saying, and I said this on a few videos ago, and anybody who follows the team, it's not rocket science, kind of should know this. This program, with the limitations on NIL that it has right now, with a coach who specializes in the development of players over several seasons and is a defensive-minded coach, with the fact that they're really not going to get, they're definitely not going to get another tandem out of the high school ranks like they did this year for the foreseeable future or ever, and are likely going to be, shut out of the top offensive talent coming in the transfer portal most years, has to figure out how to succeed. Now, part of that, yes, is getting an athletic department infrastructure in there to manage NIL and to get a GM figure in there to allocate NIL properly and strategically to do the best things possible. But the head coach has to be on board with that. GMs and head coaches in the pro level, they're always talking. Steve Peichel needs to understand that just loading up on offensive firepower every year because you don't have time to coach them up defensively is not going to be a winning formula for you, because you are not a very innovative and exceptional offensive-minded coach. You're an extremely exceptional defensive-minded coach. You can bring in an offensive-minded assistant who's going to, if he's a prodigy or just a really experienced veteran, maybe he gets the most out of the guys you have every year. And maybe you need to do that in addition to the following. And Carino points it out. Go out and get the guy who's fighting for a loose ball no matter what it takes. And that's what Peichel went out and did when he recruited Jacob Young in the transfer portal, when he recruited Cam Spencer in the transfer portal. Cam Spencer, absolute offensive force when it came to shooting and clutch shots and those things. But he was also a guy who was on the floor going after loose balls, who had a ton of steals as well, who was a defensive force to be reckoned with as well. Akwazi Yeboah, he also mentioned, similar player. Steve's got to get back to his roots, whether we're talking about recruiting or the transfer portal. His best transfer portal hits were also these guys that had the tenacity and love for the game. Now, a Jordan Durkak is that kind of guy, maybe, but you have to coach him to play within himself on offense and spend the time with him over 2 seasons at least, coaching him up defensively to do what you want to do. You have to go out there and recruit guys who have some semblance of some experience in the type of system you want to run, who have that raw desire and love for basketball and the tenacity to want to play relentless defense. And you need to spend your NIL, and the NIL that you do have, you need to allocate to keeping those guys on the roster so that as you develop them and as they learn your culture and as they learn your system, you keep them instead of losing them. Losing Mawot Mag, losing Cliff Amori was difficult for the team. And when you're trying to go out and spend on offensive players and you can't spend money to retain those guys that have been developed defensively within your system, you're never going to have a product that's going to succeed based on your coaching philosophy and program building philosophy in this modern era. So you've got to allocate your money to retention. You've got to put an athletic director and system in place. Yes, that gives you more money, fundraises better, allocates the money better, but then you've got to adjust your philosophy to, I am focused on recruiting the most tenacious, most engaged guys possible that want to play defense in my system. And I am going to spend money to retain those guys and keep them in this system. And we are going to go out there and we are going to compete. And don't tell me that you can't do it because you don't have the money. You got to raise more money, and you do have money. And it's part of the game, and you're never going to keep a guy for 4 and 5 years probably. And that's sad. I mean, me as a fan personally, and just as a general abstract commentary, I can't stand the fact that we're paying these kids, 7 figures for 1 season, and they're barely students. They're barely student athletes. Why are they Rutgers players at that point? Why do we have the name Rutgers as a university on the jersey if they're quasi-pro players who are barely going to school? Go to school. But that's a separate thing. That's a separate complaint that I have that I'll talk about on another show dedicated to philosophical musings. But for right now, let's just allocate the money that we do have to the players, and we're never going to have them for 5 years. We're never going to have them for 4 years, but if we can get them for 2 years, 3 years, hopefully 3 years, develop them, coach them up the way you used to do individually, then as a team defensively, spend the money on retention, and go out and get the guys with the most tenacity who want to get on that ball for loose balls instead of just guys who have good shooting ability that, at a lower level, or look like they can run the floor at a lower level, but you really don't know what to do with them. You've got to get back to those roots, and that may succeed or it may not, right? Because the world has changed. The league, college basketball has changed. This is not a place that is conducive to Steve Peichel's philosophy, no matter how you slice it. This is all going to be an adaptation. How do you adapt as best you can within the cards you're dealt? And somebody mentioned this too. I don't remember which show it was. I don't remember if it was Brightman or the Rutgers ran or if it was TKR. I don't remember. Somebody mentioned that, that's what Shiano says. You either, you can't change something, then you got to change the way you think about it. That's what Shiano always says. And if you can't change NIL, you can't change the way the transfer portal works right now. Well, Steve's got to change the way he thinks about it, the way he approaches it. Greg Schiano has done that. He's adapted to a point where, hey, I got to fundraise. I got to develop, but I'm going to spend my money primarily on retention. I'm going to fill some holes in the transfer portal. I'm going to recruit a certain type of personality, a certain type of player who's going to have that tenacity, dedication, and loyalty, and I'm going to reward him with retention. And Steve Peichel's got to kind of adapt, in my opinion, to that type of philosophy. I'm going to recruit a certain type of player who's going to, have that loyalty, have that tenacity, buy into this system, and then reward him with retention. And it may work, it may not, because you still don't have the 5 years that Steve is used to coach these kids up defensively. You have an AAU culture and then an NBA culture where defense is not emphasized as much. And if guys are coming in and they're uber talented, or they're looking to get the biggest paycheck they can and jump conferences and jump teams, it's going to be difficult to retain them. It's going to be difficult to find these diamond in the rough, tenacious defensive players. But that's simply got to be what Steve does. And he's either going to make some hybrid way to succeed, or he's not. Now, remember, back when they were succeeding earlier in Steve's tenure at Rutgers, yeah, they didn't. It's just like now. There was an inequity of riches, right? Now we don't have as much NIL as the top 10% of programs. But guess what? When we were making the tournament and looked formidable and could take anybody at the rack, and everybody was scared to come to the rack, we weren't in the top 10 percentile of recruiting riches. We weren't in the top 10 with getting guys to come here or talent on paper. But we still managed to compete and have respectable seasons and be exciting and be the next thing in college basketball, because we employed certain philosophies that took on the big boys. And that doesn't have to change now, right? That doesn't have to change just because the landscape has changed. We're still not in the top 10% of spending with NIL. We don't have the embarrassment of riches of the big boys, but we never did. We can still challenge them. We can be the one team out there spending money on retention and recruiting gritty players who want to jump on the floor and go crazy on full court press, and we can take it to you that way. We can be that rough and tumble guy in the Big Ten that's going to take it to you that way. And when you come to our home gym, we're gonna flex on you that way. We can be that guy without that money. Indiana had all the money in the world. They weren't that guy. We could do this, okay? And it's happened before, even before NIL. So that's what's got to happen. Now, this was my 2 cents based on these really excellent articles that recently came out doing a post-mortem of the season. I've done a post-mortem. This is another post-mortem. We're going to continue to talk about this, but we're also going to monitor transfers. We're going to monitor the team going forward. We're going to monitor the hiring of the president, the hiring of the AD, the hiring of a GM. And we're going to talk football, guys, because that's coming up soon. Spring ball on the horizon. I hope to see a lot of you guys at the spring game. I'm excited about it. Let's get back ready for the football season. Tough schedule coming up, but a lot of interesting pieces on the roster. You got to be excited. Plus, you have the NFL draft, and you expect some of our guys to go. This could be our first real decent haul since Shiano got back. It's exciting. So keep it locked here to Night Watch. And guys, remember, we are also available as an audio-only podcast on every major podcast platform. So while you're driving around, commuting in the office, type in Night Watch Larry K into Google or into your favorite podcast platform. Listen on their audio. If you're listening on the audio version, stop by the YouTube channel, Night Watch with Larry K. Click subscribe. We are edging ever so close to 1,000 subscribers. That's what we're looking for. Let's get to 1,000 subscribers before football season. Click the subscribe button. It's right here. Just click it. And I will talk to all you guys very soon. Even though it's tough, go Knights.